Hello and welcome everybody to today's Methods in Focus session, in which we will discuss the results of a unique interdisciplinary collaboration to conceptualize a framework that helps us understand the role and value of openness and collaboration in scientific research. The article is about to be published in a special issue in Industry and Innovation, but you can already find it online. My name is Christoph Grimpe and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Industry and Innovation. And today I will talk with my colleagues Susanne Beck and Marion Pötz. Susanne was the lead coordinator of developing this framework and the related paper. And Marion is an associate editor at Industry and Innovation who initiated this unique experiment as part of the Open Innovation in Science Research program. In the next 45 minutes or so, we will give you some background information on this project, and we will also talk about the challenges as well as the highlights that we experienced throughout this process. Please join our discussion by adding your questions into the chat window. Let me start with you, Marion. Can you give us some background on how you came up with the idea to ask scientists from all kinds of disciplines to jointly conceptualize and work on this project, how to think about openness and collaboration in science? What were your intentions and what were your aims?
I mean, basically, this all goes back to 2017, where we received funding for establishing an Open Innovation in Science Center, funding by the Austrian National Foundation for Research, Technology and Development. And it was quite funny because when we started working on our first research project as part of our research program, we very soon realized that knowledge and theories and empirical work on the role and value of openness and collaboration in science was extremely scattered across disciplines. And we were far away from a common understanding of what openness and collaboration in science means, and also what are the relevant dependent variables. Is it that we aim for increasing scientific productivity, for increasing impact of scientific research, for closing the science society gap, or for whatever, for democratizing science, for example? And we've seen that a lot of people in a lot of different disciplines are discussing this in their own silos, in a sense, whether that's the science of science scholars and with scientometrics, the science and technology studies scholars, people in research policy, open science people who focus a lot on open data sharing, on open access publications, also like us, innovation studies scholars who talk a lot about university-industry collaborations or the role of crowds, sociologists or economists of science, and most importantly, scientists from all kinds of disciplines like the medical sciences or physics who have developed their own understanding of what openness and collaboration in science means to them. And as I mentioned, we soon realized that we need to integrate these different views in order to get a more comprehensive understanding. And to do so, we initiated the Open Innovation Science Research Conference series, where we wanted to bring these people to the table, so and to make them discuss and share their different insights. And Susanne, if you remember back then, and then Christoph was also part of that, when we planned the first conference, it became clear that we should go beyond talking and discussing. We wanted to produce something that other researchers could use and build their own research on. And then we thought, why not using all those smart brains of the conference to co-create an understanding of what openness and collaboration science means, to identify the relevant variables and to build something together that other scholars can build upon. And that's how it all started, basically.
Mm-hmm. And if you think back of the Open Innovation in Science Research Conference, did actually everything work out as you have imagined it?
So first of all, it was a wonderful conference. I have very good memories of it. It was great to meet so many different people from so many different disciplines. But I think with respect to the paper that we are talking about today, I think that the great thing back then was, and while we now have all learned all kinds of very productive ways of collaborating online, and I'm a big fan of that myself. However, the beauty of that conference in 2019 was that we could meet physically, because there were people from so many different disciplines, from physics, from the humanities, from the social sciences, who have never talked to each other before. And I think the physical setting and the way we organized this co-conceptualization approach made them talk to each other at eye level in a sense and learn to appreciate the different viewpoints. And there was kind of a point at the conference where we could really see that people were developing a common understanding. And I think that was the basis for then enabling a very fruitful and efficient online collaboration process.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, let me also talk a little bit about the participants at this research conference, who were all scientists from all kinds of scientific disciplines, so a really high degree of diversity among the members, among the crowd members, you could say. And oftentimes you hear, well, managing these scientists can be really like herding cats, right? Would you agree to this statement? And if so, how did you manage to keep everyone on track for this joint project?
So, well, thank you. This is a great question, Christoph. So the short answer is deadlines are tremendously helpful. The longer answer is that in every step of this process, we try to be very precise in how we formulated the tasks for the co-authors, always keeping in mind, of course, not influence them too much. So, for example, this included very general tasks when we asked them to provide insights about what they know from their fields, for example, about the antecedents to openness. But then we also directed them very clearly to where they should include their input and how to do that. So we pointed them towards a particular table in a particular document, and we showed them how to share the information in a particular format and by a certain date. And my impression was that the more specific the task was formulated, the more activity we also observed afterwards in the online documents. But such tasks would also be very specific, and we saw that especially later in the stages of the process that this was very helpful. For example, when we spotted contradicting arguments from two authors or two groups of authors, we surfaced those contradictions, and we helped initiating the discussions between them and to find the reason why they found these contradicting findings. And we also asked them to find a way in how they could present both arguments, but in a coherent way. And oftentimes this resulted in just placing the findings in different sections of the article. So overall, I think it's a combination of being very transparent and clear about the process, actively facilitating the discussions and interactions among the co-authors, and in particular, the enduring engagement and the discipline of all scholars to keep deadlines, which helped, so to say, the cats to herd themselves, if we can say that way.
Yeah, and Susanne, most of the interaction was, of course, managed by you. So the burden was mainly on your shoulders to interact with the scientists and to manage those cats and delivering on time, right? But what would you say, what were the most challenging things, the most challenging aspects of this collaborative process?
So the most challenging moment, I think it was about synthesizing the broad range of different arguments without compromising on the content, which turned out to be quite challenging and required several additional steps that we did not have planned from the beginning, but they were simply necessary to define a common ground that reflected all the perspectives. So, for example, instead of beginning with writing the text immediately, we asked the co-authors to first collect the literature for the different boxes and arrows that we had in the OIS Research Framework in tables. And just asking this also resulted already in more than 200 entries about what is relevant. But having this in a format of tables was much easier to process than having already text spelled out. So this helped us to identify the similarities and differences before initiating the actual writing process. And by this, we could surface important discussions early on, and it also helped to structure the article later on.
Right.
But, yeah.
And from the perspective of the co-authors, what do you think, what kind of experiences did they have with this process?
So I think to answer this, you of course should ask the other co-authors. But my impression was that overall they were really positive about being part of this collaborative experiment. And we received a lot of positive feedback during and after the process, actually. For example, a senior scholar from the US, and I'm quoting here, said that it was a truly wonderful experience to write in an open, collaborative, and cross-disciplinary manner, not just to write about open science, but to actually practice it. And yet another leading scholar from the US wrote, it's truly a model for projects to come. So I guess I cannot add much to that, but this is at least what they told us. But besides being positive, we noticed that there also is a feeling of ownership for the article and the OIS concept itself. So, for example, when other scholars started to engage with our concept later on in their own publications, we realized that there just are some things that we can and should further specify. And of course, we wanted to do that in a collaborative manner. And then we reached out to our group of co-authors. Within a single day, more than 35 immediately replied that they are on board for this new collaborative journey to further specify the OIS concept. So I perceive that as a very positive signal for how they have experienced the collaborative process.
And it's, of course, also a signal that, well, it actually can work out, right? So writing a paper in the social sciences can work out with such a high number of collaborators. But now, given that we have so many people here in this audience who might also be interested in setting up and launching such a collaborative writing project, what would be your advice to these people? What is the best thing that they should do right at the beginning? What should they take care about? What are the things that you would like to tell them?
That's a good question. So the first thing that comes to my mind is that they should seriously reflect upon whether a collaborative approach is really the right approach to their particular project. It can be very beneficial, but it also may be less suitable for other types of projects. For example, I think it was a very appropriate approach in our case, as we wanted to integrate diverse knowledge, and we wanted to reduce the risk of overlooking relevant literature. However, one should just keep in mind the costs as well. And despite the coordination, there are also some side effects that are not immediately visible. For example, the more co-authors you have, the less people are also available to review other work when you submit it to a journal. Or also a large number of co-authors is not really rewarded when you think of tenure requirements. So there are certain trade-offs to keep in mind before initiating such a large collaboration. But once you have decided to do it, it's critical, I would say, to assign sufficient resources to assign resources, especially in terms of time, in order to keep the ball running. But besides that, there are also, I would say, there's not one size fits all approach. So such collaborative processes always need to be adapted to a particular purpose and to the particular type of paper. For example, we saw that when we designed the second article that I just mentioned, where we have much more interdependencies between the different parts of the papers. And to handle this increased complexity, we decided to work in subgroups to create the first draft of a certain subsection before revising and editing it with a larger group. So this was just to make sure that we can reach the necessary depth of our arguments within each subsection and maintain the connections between the subsections. Mm-hmm. And there are also a couple of practical points that I'm happy to share if the audience is interested in them.
So now we've talked quite a bit about the process, and it's a tedious process, as we can learn from you, but it's also potentially a very rewarding process because you get to know very different people, you get to work together with many different people. But let's focus a bit more now about the content of the article. So what is this article really about? Marion, let me turn to you. What would you say is, from your perspective, the most relevant outcome of the paper?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that question very nicely relates to what has just been posted in the chat by Marcel with respect to boundary conditions and influencing factors of how you can think about openness and collaboration in science, and how we integrate them as part of the research article. I think that from content-wise, I think the most interesting thing is, as I mentioned initially, what is the relevant dependent variable when we talk about openness and collaboration in science? And of course, there's a lot of discussion on democratizing science and increasing the impact of scientific research. But what about the scientists themselves? And what are the conditions under which scientists should engage in an open and collaborative approach? When is it relevant for the scientists or for the research group to do so? Because in many cases, when I talk to scientists, it's like, well, that's on top work. We do that on top because their funding organization requires it, or because, well, there's some other box that I need to tick. And I think it was the process that we did. It was very interesting to see and to discuss, well, engaging in openness and collaboration in science needs to have a positive effect on the science itself, on the quality of the science, the novelty, the efficiency, and of course the potential impact. And if beyond that it contributes to the democratization of science, that's wonderful. And of course that's all what we are interested in many ways. But I think that discussion to think about which form and degree of openness and collaboration contributes to increasing the productivity of science on different dimensions, and what are the boundary conditions and relevant contingencies that influence whether or not we can observe these positive effects on the outcome. I think that is a main contribution of the article, and that is something that will hopefully also inspire, and we can already observe that people are building on that work to design new research projects in order to empirically study these boundary conditions and contingencies. And I think that's the main contribution. And what Marcel posted in the chat, I think nicely relates to that thinking about these individual or organizational or ecosystem level boundary conditions or contingencies that influence whether an open and collaborative science process is contributing to a relevant outcome. I think learning from each other is what made the outcome so interesting. I don't think that we would have come up with the same outcome had it just been a discussion among Christoph, you and me and Susanne. So I think that's the biggest contribution. And allow me, Christoph, to step in here. There is an interesting question also in the chat that asked whether there were past or similar multi-author projects that we could draw on from our experience. Not really. I mean, there was, of course, a project that Industry and Innovation also was part of, an article on discussing open innovation. But I think the interesting thing about this process, and for at least for me, and I guess for Susanne the same, and Christoph, it was new terrain in a sense that just really doing this all from scratch. So this was not the coordination that Susanne outlined. We did not tell people what to work on. So we didn't junk it up and we say, you write a chapter about university industry collaboration, you write a chapter about crowd science. So it all really emerged bottom up. So it condensed the voices of around 50 people. And I think that is different. And we didn't have any experience with that, both in the overall conceptualization work that we did offline in the conference, and then also in the way we filled that concept as part of the online collaboration. So there were lots of learnings from our side, and to a certain extent, we reflect upon that in the article. But of course, that's something we also, and we very much appreciate this invitation here to talk about the process. And we also plan for more insights into the process and all the learnings we had along the process. Right, Susanne?
Absolutely. And if I may just add to what you just said, as it was a bottom-up approach, we couldn't, or we have not designed the process from A to Z from the beginning. It was a learning process. It was a deliberate decision to co-create it, meaning that we really wanted to assign each and every co-author equal decision rights. And it also had as a consequence that we had several loops. And if I remember correctly, the first additional step that we added was already at the same conference, because we thought that we would end up with one single research framework already by the end of the conference. But in fact, we ended up with 6. And each of these 6 models had something so particular that we all wanted to keep. So this is when we decided, okay, we just need another step that we didn't plan for, to align those models and then loop them back to the group of authors to discuss whether they agree, whether they see what they came up with initially, and have several revision loops here. So this is just an example that co-creation really requires you to be flexible. And in that sense, flexible in terms of your timeline, in terms of the content, but also in terms of the process itself.
Maybe, Christoph, another question that I just saw in the chat relates to what we think the authors learned from that process that they could use in future projects. And Susanne, you have to help me out here, but I think one thing that was amazing for me in the process is usually, and maybe that's just our field, but you know, there can be conflicting views and people can be quite tough on each other, both on the argument, but also on the person. And what I found extremely interesting and very positive is the respectful way people listened to very different viewpoints. And I think this is probably that's not so much that you can use in future articles. In that, I think this is more like a personal development. The way you are able to listen to someone who formulates something in a totally different language that you may disagree, and how you can integrate that into your thinking and eventually feel that you learn something in the long run. So that was something that I think is very, very helpful. I learned a lot more than in a lot of other collaborations by just learning about all these different viewpoints. I think that would be my answer to that question. Christoph and Susanne, any add-ons to that?
Let me echo this with an example I remember from the conference very vividly. It was, I just remember that when there was a group consisting of a physicist and you know, an economist and I think a sociologist from all across the world, so from Scandinavia, from Australia, from the US, and they were just standing there together, talking about the different conditions under which it makes sense for them in their respective fields to collaborate with each other. And I got myself thinking, so this is amazing how these people manage to understand each other having these different terminologies in mind. And I was thinking, okay, that is actually science of science. And just as you said, I think why it worked is the very open and constructive attitudes of all of these co-authors to surface and manage conflicting and often tacit assumptions about how research is done in the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities.
I think my personal view on the conference was also very much influenced by this piece that we collaboratively then developed, in the sense that I don't want to say for the first time, but really in a long time, I felt that there was really a tangible output from this specific conference that all of us could feel was very valuable to us, right? Oftentimes you go to a conference, you visit a conference and you present your paper, you might get some feedback that you could incorporate into your article, but oftentimes that's it, right? And we have interesting keynotes. Typically, we have debates, we have discussions at conferences. But what is typically lacking is that we sort of use this as an opportunity to deliberate as a scholarly community what we believe is sort of the state of the art in a certain field, what we believe is really the future of research in a certain field. Where should our profession develop, and what are the forces that drive us to do our research on a daily basis? And I think that particular conference with this output, this article that we then collaboratively developed was a fantastic piece of actually showcasing these dynamics and basically bringing all the discussions that we had in a collective logbook, a recording, so to speak, from the entire conference discussions into this one piece article. And that's also why I believe that the resulting special issue that we are about to publish in Industry and Innovation will be a great example of showcasing these findings and these motions that we discussed during the conference.
Allow me to step in here, Christoph. Maybe we can reverse the roles. I think what we have seen that there's apparently an interest in this article for the process, also for the outcome. And being an associate editor of Industry and Innovation myself, I've just checked that the article very quickly moved to the top 5 list of the most read articles of the journal ever, which is quite nice. Are you, as an editor now, as the editor-in-chief, are you happy with such an outcome? And how does that, to which extent does it contribute to the journal's strategy or to the journal's purpose in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, it goes without saying that I'm very happy about the article, right? So, but of course, we have to see that an academic journal is only so good and so relevant as the articles that are being published in this journal. So we live from the fact that we have authors that are willing to submit their best research to us. And of course, that's very important. So when we receive such a piece, and we talked about how to actually publish these pieces in the special issue a lot, of course, that reflects very much that we believe this is a super relevant topic that we believe needs to be tackled. So you could say the idea of this article and the special issue was, of course, motivated by the fact that we believe that this is very, very relevant for our community, for our profession. So in that sense, we also believe that this is a great contribution that might spark further on discussion. And of course, we are using industry innovation always also as an outlet to spark these discussions and to motivate authors to basically take our research and build on this research in order to develop their own ideas. And then ideally, of course, also submit those ideas to our journal. In that sense, this is, of course, very much in line with our overall journal strategy that we have at Industry and Innovation to experiment, but also to support new ways how we can conduct our research and how we can disseminate our research results, right? So we are very open to new formats of articles. We're very open to new ideas. Of course, we place a high emphasis on scholarly rigor, but we need to be relevant as well. And we are trying to bridge this rigor relevance discussion here quite explicitly also by publishing articles like this. Let me also add one it's not really an anecdote, but it's of course a fun fact. This is the very first article in this special issue that has been completed, right? All the other articles in the special issue are still in the revision and the review process. Now you could say, is this a more efficient way of writing then an article if you just put in so many people on the article? First of all, I would say, well, it's basically due to the leadership of Susanne managing the co-authors. But secondly, of course, we have to keep in mind that having so many people from diverse disciplines and with diverse viewpoints contributing to this article also means that we have sort of a built-in review process. Right. So while for a regular article, we have, of course, the traditional peer review process where we have reviewers that we ask to provide their opinions on the paper. That takes a lot of time until the reviewers have read it, have commented it, and send it back to us, and we relay it to the authors. And then the authors have some time to revise and send it back to us. And then this sort of might repeat for quite some time. So with this collaborative article, you could say we have also some sort of shortcut to the review process. So we've actually managed to bring in the review process into this article right from the very beginning by having these elaborate discussions and by having these very fruitful also discussions about what we should leave out and what we should bring in. Because I think, Susanne, you remember we had a lot of pages at the very beginning that the co-authors supplied to us. And of course, we would need to make a decision and collaboratively decide what would be the essence that should eventually end up in the paper. So in that regard, I think it was a very rewarding experience. I think it's very much in line with industry and innovation strategy. And of course, we are very much also looking forward for future collaborative articles in that regard.
Maybe, Christoph, we can take, I see there is an interesting question by Sarah in the chat. She's asking, basically it's two questions. First one is, what are, in your opinion, important shared values for creating a successful culture of collaboration? And then the second part is, what were the dark sides of the process? I leave the dark side question to Susanne. Allow me to try and answer to the first one. What are important shared values for creating a successful culture of collaboration? I think the good thing here in this process is the conference, and then also some co-authors kind of entered the process without having participated in the conference because they were so keen on being part of that. But I think the good thing about this here is that all these people that were part of the conference, they had a genuine interest in discussing the role and value of openness and collaboration science beyond these disciplinary silos or boundaries. They also, as we know from creativity and innovation literature, that intrinsic motivation makes a big difference here. So of course, they all had very different viewpoints on the topic, but what unified their contribution was a serious interest in finding new ways of discussing the role and value of openness and collaboration in science. So I think that made it a lot easier, and that created some kind of common grounds from a more general cultural point of view. And then I think this respectful appreciation of different viewpoints. And I think here the conference helped in the way we organized the conference. We made these people, we helped these people to appreciate each other, not seeing it as kind of these people disturb my thinking about it, but these people enrich my thinking about it. Susanne, what about the dark sides here?
So for those who know me, know that I love to talk about the dark sides, but actually there are not many dark sides to talk about from this project. Of course, there were challenges, both from a practical perspective, but also from a technical perspective. And I think that's a good opportunity to share some insights we learned along the process in terms of practicalities. As you said, Marian, it's super helpful if you have the chance to build this in-person meeting and to build this common understanding in the beginning. But then later on in the process, when you move to the online collaboration, it is helpful to break larger tasks down into smaller buckets, and because it just helps to keep everyone on the same page. If you try to keep the big picture of article in mind, because while you adjust the process, it's easy to get lost in certain subtasks and continue forever in finding the right formulation. It's important to keep the big picture and also to remind the co-authors on them. And how we manage this is by sharing figures, for example, because figures can tell more than 1,000 words. And also another insight we had was keep the instructions and how to share the content very clear, but also very short, because people tend to not read long emails, for example. So this might be a minor thing, but it's really helpful. And in terms of the technical challenges, we had long discussions with the co-authors as well, in terms of what online collaboration tool to use. And after trying out different tools, we ended up with Google's G Suite, so all the Google Docs and Google Sheets and so forth. And it's always a trade-off between an ease of use and the level of control that you have. And so in terms of that you can track who contributed what part. So Google G Suite was very helpful in that regard, because you didn't have any entry barriers. You could just start writing and focus on the context. However, one time I wanted to access the main document, so the one document we were working on for a year, and Google just told me that I'm not allowed to access the document anymore because we have simply reached the maximum number of comments. So that was a quite thrilling moment, because Google Doc didn't even let me make a copy of that document. So while I was fearing for my job, we actually managed to successfully find a workaround to access that document again, and have all the discussions going on and all the edits that have happened since the last backup, that of course was a couple of days old, to recover it and to continue where we have been. So this is in terms of challenges, as it's like the process itself. It requires substantial flexibility, but you usually always find a way how to manage these challenges.
Christoph, I see quite a lot of questions popping up in the chat. So maybe let's finish what maybe we have planned for discussing, or what you have planned for asking us, and then turn to the questions in the chat. Is that okay for you?
Of course. And I only have one more question, essentially, Marian, to you. What are your future plans with respect to coming up with more collaboratively written articles? Would you say these are connected then to the next editions of the Open Innovation in Science Research Conferences, or what are your future plans?
Yeah, I mean, we're not planning to write a conceptual piece on open innovation in science anytime soon again in this way, for sure. But there's two things here that might be interesting to mention, and Susanne briefly mentioned it already. First of all, the article was very nicely and constructively critiqued, yeah, by distinguished authors in the field. So we're currently developing some collaboratively written kind of paper that clarifies things that were not clear in this article. That's one thing. And then Susanne mentioned that most of the co-authors immediately said, yes, we want to be part of that. But more importantly, I think what we have planned, and Christoph, you're also part of the organizing team of this conference, what we have planned is to use that conference as a space for walking the talk. Because we usually study like patient engagement in the medical sciences, but we never think about how we could use open and collaborative approaches in our own research. So we study it, but we don't use it. So what we have agreed upon after this first conference, and the nice way the outcome with that paper turned out to be, that we run an open innovation science experiment at each conference, so that we try out new ways of using these open and collaborative methods in our research and prototype them. And just like a bit more than a month ago, we had this year's conference, and we tried out a new way of coming up with research proposals. So what we did is we invited scientists from all kinds of fields, physicists and medical scientists and legal scholars and mental health scholars, to pitch their big challenges when they do openness and collaboration in their research, as an inspiration for thinking about what do we know about these challenges from our field, from science and technology studies and science studies, and then to co-create research proposals that we will then share in an open access publication that we do together with the CERN Journal of Experimental Innovation. So it's multiple authors who contributed to that, but not in like conceptualizing something, but in developing concrete research projects and then publishing these research proposals as part of a journal publication. So whether or not next year's Open Innovation Science experiment will turn into a paper or not, I don't know yet, because we don't know what it will be. If this audience has any ideas of what it could be, feel free to email us, and of course think about participating in the conference. The call will soon be out. But yes, we definitely want to walk the talk and apply open and collaborative approaches to our own research. Whether it ends up being a multi-authored paper or not, we'll see in the future.
Marian, we have a very relevant question here also from Fatima. And of course, this is reflective of the fact that we are typically carrying out our research in a very privileged environment. We have a good infrastructure for doing our research in the Western world, in the global North, you could say. But of course, in the article, we also hint at the fact that open innovation in science practices might actually help us do something against the structural disadvantages that researchers in the global South might face, right? And of course, the question here is, are you aware of any projects, any attempts to capture open innovation in science practices and approaches in this area of the world, in the global South?
I mean, like spontaneously, I think there's two things, and there's a very nice article in a 2018, I think, Nature special issue on the role of co-producing research where they report a number of really cool projects where people all around the world, including people in Africa and South America and other parts of the world, engage as co-researchers in, for example, climate research projects. That's on a project basis. But on a more like, I'm not aware of any particular initiatives to study open innovation science in the global south, but what I can report is these, particularly when we go online and do online collaborative approaches, and we have seen that in this year's Open Innovation in Science Research Conference, we had so many more people from so many more parts of the world participate, both in the conference and now also in this new Open Innovation in Science experiment. So also new formats of engaging with each other enable us to not require big travel budgets or whatever budgets in order to engage in collaborative approaches. So I think this is a very relevant question, and I definitely think we should think about that more proactively, of how we could use that as a lever to be more inclusive in our way of doing research.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from Adrian here, and that's probably a question that you, Susanne, might be very well able to answer. So Adrian is actually talking about the standard development process. And in the end, what we do in this article is also a little bit about finding a common understanding of open innovation in science by elaborating on this framework. And if you look at these international standardizing bodies, organizations that we have for all kinds of things, technical things, whatever it is, these are typically elaborated upon by industry associations, by stakeholders, you could say, who come together in order to jointly agree on these standards. Are you aware whether anybody from standard bodies, standardizing organizations, were also participating in this research project?
Not that I'm aware of. So we had, of course, a lot of discussions to what extent we can standardize particular parts of the process itself. Now speaking on a higher level, but I'm not aware that any of the co-authors was a member in such a committee.
Okay. Yeah.
Allow me to add something here. It was a blind spot in our landscape. I would have loved for someone from a standards organization to be part of that. And Jeremy, if you want to reach out to us and participate in that in the future, I'd love to. This was really a blind spot. We should have done so, Christoph, right?
That was Adrian, yes, but that's totally true.
Sorry.
That's totally true.
Okay,
It would be super interesting to incorporate that perspective, especially the negotiation, because when we talk about these standards, it's also oftentimes very much driven by business interests. So there is very much more this idea of negotiations between stakeholders who all have quite some high stakes in this entire process, because they might have made investments into a particular technology that they would like to see becoming the new standard. But here's the question from Jeremy now. Jeremy reflects a bit more about the role of scientific disciplines, right? Particularly also with respect to the collaboration between universities and industries. And he is asking, how much is the particular field of science actually responsible for the scope and nature of collaborative activities? Could you reflect on this a bit more? Is this something that our conceptual paper would help us address as well?
I mean, first of all, Adrian and Jeremy, sorry for mixing up your names. Second, I think that Christoph, you are the best to answer that question given your expertise. But we did have physicists as co-authors in that article, and we also have even more physicists and other natural researchers part of ongoing collaborative approaches. And I think there are field-specific differences. And one of the things that we point out to is that we need, building on this conceptual framework, we need more empirical work to do large-scale empirical work to better understand contingencies on the level of the scientific field. But I think, Christoph, I'm sure you have more to say on that.
Exactly. I totally agree to what you said, Marian. It's, of course, something that we need to take into account, right? So scientific disciplines vary. They might be more application oriented. They might be more oriented towards basic research. And also for historical reasons, some scientific disciplines are much more inclined to collaborate with other disciplines or to collaborate with industry. There is an entire body of literature on exactly that question that talks about the disciplinary effects in industry science collaboration, but also in collaboration more generally. And of course, when we look at CERN, the facility that is maintained by thousands of scientists and engineers, that is of course by definition a facility where collaboration happens. It's also quite insightful and of course also remarkable if you see publications coming out of these big laboratories with oftentimes hundreds of co-authors, which is something that at least not yet is something we have to deal with or we have to orchestrate, but I'm sure even Susanne would be able to manage these processes. So there are these disciplinary differences that we have to take into account, and I'm very happy to refer you to some literature if you want, because this would be very broad now to tackle. But there is another question from Sarah that I think is very important, which also goes a bit deeper into the article itself and the main contribution of the article. And here we actually talk about the different levels of analysis, right? Where do we see actually the benefits of having these different levels of analysis being considered by the framework that is elaborated upon in the article?
Allow me, Christoph, to add one more anecdote to the question, to Jeremy's question and to the way you answered it. At this year's Open Innovation Science Research Conference, we had a senior scholar from CERN pitching his challenges with openness and collaboration with science. And one of the things that he talked about was, if you have these hundreds of co-authors, how do you distribute value here in this group? Not only to create value in terms of new knowledge, but how do you arrange for all these people getting a piece of the pie in a sense? So I think this is a super interesting research challenge that our type of research could actually address. Now going to Sarah's question, I think, and Susanne, please chip in here. I think this was probably the most intense discussion at the conference when we conceptualized it. What are those relevant levels of analysis with respect to what are the levels of influencing factors, boundary conditions, and contingencies? What is it? What does individual mean? What is group versus organizational? What is ecosystem? What are ecosystem characteristics that influence a scientist's decision to engage in an open and collaborative process? So I think, and it took us quite a while to figure out, and there was lots of disagreement on what these levels are. But I think people clearly understood that we need to understand that individual levels, so if we go like more on the micro foundations, individual characteristics and attitudes of scientific researchers, even if they have, if there are interdependencies with organizational drivers or barriers, they are equally important. There's a nice, one of the researchers back then gave a nice anecdote that we have really attractive incentive systems for our scientists to openly share their data, but no one does it. Yeah. So you can get quite a lot of money for sharing your data from your study, but you don't do it. So and if you do a deep dive here, you will understand that there is individual level drivers. How I see myself of practicing data sharing or practicing data reuse will be interdependent with whether or not my institution or my research group provides me with support for engaging in that. So in that sense, I think the multi-level perspective is extremely helpful in conceptualizing also the interdependencies across levels of analysis.
Susanne, anything else to add to this?
Very much so. I wanted exactly to point towards the interdependencies, and that in order to identify and research and also empirically research the interdependencies between the different levels, we need to spell them out. And as we discussed earlier, what was challenging in the process was also to find a way in how to present and discuss conflicting prior findings in different respective fields. So, for example, when we saw that certain individual characteristics were helpful for collaboration or openness, we saw in a different field that it might be exactly opposite characteristics that could be considered a driver or positive associated with collaboration. And then figuring out why is that the case. So figuring out these conditions, contingencies on when we observe what. This was part of the discussions when we came up with the multi-level antecedents to openness and collaboration. And I think having this understanding and this framework to see that there are the different factors that we need to keep in mind and see them not apart, but really as one concept or as interrelated. This helps to provide the space and for the discussions.
Well, that concludes our session. Thank you very much. We had a wonderful opportunity here to talk about both open innovation in science, its importance, and how we should think about it for the future to come. It also gave us a nice opportunity to talk actually about the process that was behind co-authoring the article with a lot of co-authors that needed to be managed. On behalf of Marian and Susanne, let me thank you very much in the audience for your questions.